What if Boris refuses to quit? It's likely if Boris Johnson goes down a no-deal path, many will want him out of office. But what if he refuses? Before we get into the main thrust of the video, if you think information about Brexit should be debated rather than ignored or biasedly presented, then subscribe to this channel. After the 4th of September, after the summer recess in Parliament, it's likely the leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, will table a motion of no confidence against the Prime Minister. Likely, the no confidence motion itself will be aimed at stopping a no-deal Brexit. And so various anti-no deal Tories, such as Philip Hammond, Rory Stewart and Dominic Grieve, would likely eat into the slim Tory DUP majority of one, making a majority of Parliament against Boris Johnson. This could be as much as 30 to 40 of his own MPs, with people like Kate Hoey of Labour voting with the government in favour of a no deal. But the majority of Parliament will be against the Prime Minister, and so the Prime Minister would lose the motion of no confidence. Boris Johnson then has 14 days to resign and to try to form a government. It's likely that Boris, being a no-deal supporter, will not resign and gather his Brexit war cabinet, Michael Gove, Stephen Barclay, Sajid Javid, Geoffrey Cox and Dominic Raab. Unlike the normal cabinet, which is not allowed to discuss Brexit, this cabinet is continually plotting Brexit next steps, so they likely already or will already have a plan for this circumstance. After 14 days of trying to find a government, a second no confidence motion is held on that new government. Labour, the SNP, the Lib Dems, Plaid and the Greens are all against leaving the EU without a deal, along with the Tory MPs I talked about earlier. With them all together, they could form a government with a majority in Parliament, and with the sole aim of stopping a no-deal Brexit and calling a general election. With someone to lead such a coalition that isn't an active player in party political leadership, but who is a statesman or stateswoman, like Margaret Beckett, previous Labour leader, there is a chance this temporary government could survive long enough to negotiate an extension to Article 50 and call an election. But it could just as easily fall apart. Some, like the Lib Dems and Greens, will want a second referendum. The SNP will want to guarantee to the people of Scotland that they had an opportunity to remain in the EU. Or they will want a second independence referendum. Meanwhile, half of Labour and some Tories will want to extend Article 50 with the intention of negotiating Theresa May's deal with some tweaks and possibly a customs union, while the other half of the Labour Party will want to remain in the EU altogether, doing so through a second referendum. No Unionist party will want to side with the pro-independence Scottish National Party. But if Margaret Beckett or whoever is the interim Prime Minister can put forward the point that the purpose of the extension is to allow time for a general election so the public can decide, then this interim government might just survive long enough to call a general election. Of course, it doesn't stop Boris Johnson and the Brexit Party winning the most seats in the next election and leaving anyway without a deal. But taking it back to the no confidence motion, if the Prime Minister loses a motion and refuses to resign, it's then up to the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, to advise the Queen the wish to set a date for a general election. He could just as easily refuse to set a date before October the 31st, which would mean the UK leaving the EU without a deal. If Boris Johnson lost a no confidence motion in the Commons, there would be a 14-day period where the government, or a new one formed in that short space of time, must persuade MPs to pass a fresh vote of confidence. If not, a general election would take place 25 days after the original government was dissolved. But a resigning Prime Minister who accepts a new administration must notify the Queen, who then appoints the new leader on his or her recommendation. If Boris refuses to resign, the Queen may be called to get involved in the matter. So it would be up to the Queen to decide what to do next. Parliament would still be sitting. There would be a PM refusing to resign, and perhaps another group of MPs trying to go to Brussels to ask for an extension. Brussels would have to decide who they would listen to as well. If a majority is found in Parliament, they could easily amend the date of exit day in the EU Withdrawal Act, forcing the PM to seek an extension. But it all depends who the PM is, how willingly they ask for an extension, and more importantly, if all EU member states agree to that extension. The courts might be able to rule on any legality if it was broken, but they wouldn't be able to decide which course was most politically sensible. That job is up to a politician. Having said that, the person who hires and fires the Prime Minister, the person who gives royal assent to bills in Parliament, and the person who approves the general election is the Queen. She would be the decision maker when neither Parliament nor the Prime Minister could agree. There are three main options she could take. The first and most likely option is to side with Parliament and give royal assent to a bill that calls for an extension of Article 50 and a general election. This amendment to the EU Withdrawal Act to get the Prime Minister to seek to extend the Article 50 deadline and then amending the Fixed Terms Parliaments Act to allow Parliament to set a date for the next election rather than the Prime Minister, would then need to be proposed and approved by a majority of Parliament before getting royal assent by the Queen, or before October the 31st. Getting this right would be seen as apolitical if the extension was temporary and the election was fair. Getting it wrong, however, could mean Remain parties do better in the election, and eventually the UK revokes Article 50 altogether and remains in the EU. If a future Brexit party, or equivalent, then proposes a referendum on the monarchy and blames the monarchy for it as a result, it might work against the Queen's favour. The second option is to side with the Prime Minister, allow him to stay in office till an election date of his choosing, keeping the Fixed Terms Parliaments Act the same, which might happen anyway if Parliament runs out of time. Get this right, and the blame lies solely on Boris Johnson. But if a no-deal Brexit happens to cause economic recession and the breakup of the UK, then once again, the future monarchy might be less significant in the future Britain. Finally, if a no-confidence motion was held and there wasn't enough time to amend any bills, but despite the expressed will of Parliament, the Prime Minister wasn't seeking an extension or setting a date for an election, the Queen could sack Boris Johnson as Prime Minister and appoint a new Prime Minister who immediately does seek an extension and calls an election. Get this right, and the monarchy would have saved the UK from either potential economic disaster in a no-deal situation or political disaster by having a lame duck Prime Minister. Get it wrong, however, and the monarchy has just appointed the next worst Prime Minister, or set a catalyst of events going that lead the country into either hellish realities of leaving without a deal or remaining in the EU, or the purgatory of never-ending Article 50 extensions. Either way, Brexit could prove to be the biggest constitutional battle in the country's history. But do you agree with me? Join in the debate below and subscribe.